Good afternoon, everyone. We are pleased to have you join us as we continue our series of virtual town halls hosted by Digital Promise's League of Innovative Schools. Today, our focus is on bridging the homework gap. The COVID-19 pandemic has exponentially amplified the deep inequities that exist in U.S. education. With the abrupt transition to home-based learning, data has shown that 20% of parents state that their children cannot complete their schoolwork because they do not have access to a computer at home. And 22% said they do not have a reliable internet connection at home. The gap is even more pronounced for Black, Hispanic, and lower income households. My name is Kimberly Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the League of Innovative Schools. And today I'm joined by the President and CEO of Digital Promise, Cator, FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel, and two League of Innovative Schools Superintendents, Steve Webb of Vancouver Public Schools in Washington State, and Baron Davis of Richland School Public Schools in South Carolina. For the format of this session, we will begin with a set of questions and transition to audience QA for the last 20 minutes. We invite you to type your questions into the QA. And now I'd like to welcome our guests for today. Hello, hello. All righty. Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you.
Hi there.
So let's go ahead and get started. Jessica, we're going to start with you. Welcome. You have coined the phrase homework gap, citing data including the fact that 12 million students do not have basic access to the internet. Can you set the stage for us today by defining the homework gap?
Sure. You know, we hear all the time about the digital divide, and working as a commissioner at the Federal Communications Commission, we're comfortable with that vocabulary, talking about spectrum bands and fiber facilities. But I think we really have to talk about the digital divide in a way that people can relate to. And so when I got to the FCC, I decided I would start visiting schools and classrooms across the country, from Alaska to Colorado to Virginia. I would go and visit, and I'd ask about their internet connectivity in class and how E-rate, a program the FCC oversees to bring connectivity to schools and libraries across this country, was working for them. And you know, it didn't matter if I went to a small town or a big city, a rural area or an urban area. I heard the same thing over and over and over again from teachers, superintendents, and administrators. They'd said, we're getting great connectivity in our school. Our classrooms have broadband. We're working with Wi-Fi. But when I send those students home and I ask them to do schoolwork at night, I've got this big problem. So many of my students are not connected at home. And increasingly that's holding my educational potential back, because I've got to think about equity and access. What are we going to do about this part of the digital divide? So I went back and I studied some numbers, and I found that about 7 in 10 teachers assign homework that requires internet access. But data from the FCC say that 1 in 3 households does not have an internet connection. So where those numbers overlap is what I started calling the homework gap, to try to draw attention to this part of the digital divide. And now, you know, we're at another level, because those students stuck in the homework gap used to rely on libraries and coffee shops and fast food restaurants and being able to go to the houses of friends and family to get online, write their English papers, and crank out some math sets. But here we are now in this crisis with more than 50 million students who are told to go home. We've got to stop and recognize so many of them cannot connect to the digital classroom. For so many of them stuck in the homework gap, that digital classroom's locked. So I hope we can use this crisis to figure out how to make it a national policy to connect every student, because that's the way they're going to have a fair shot at education in the future, both during this crisis, but also on the other side of it.
Great. Thank you for just underscoring the stark realities, particularly with the pandemic. Karen, from your vantage point leading national education technology organizations and initiatives, can you frame up for us the spectrum of the technology access challenge for schools? Are you on mute? There we go.
I will be that meme today. Yes. So thank you very much, and thanks, Jessica. Your work over the years has been incredibly inspiring and helpful. And hopefully this is a time that we actually can make some progress against the homework gap. You know, so there's two parts of the access puzzle. One is the device, and the other is access, is internet access. Through E-rate and through the work of the FCC and the U.S. Department of Education and others, the in-school internet access has been close to complete for the time being, right? We'll always have to upgrade, we'll always have to add bandwidth and that kind of thing, but you know, schools and libraries have been pretty well resourced with E-rate. But now we have this new challenge of home access, and we've talked about that for at least 5 years, this homework gap. And now the homework gap is the all-the-time gap. It's everything. It's whether kids have have access or not. And Jessica, I saw your tweet this morning that a student in Vermont said that they didn't have access because their data plan ran out. So what's interesting is, so to understand the device access and the internet access at home, schools need to do a lot of data collection, and it's not sufficient to just say, hey, do you have access at home? Because it really depends, and there are a couple things to consider. So first of all is the type of access. Second of all is the amount, whether it is unlimited or whether there's a stopping point, a place that you run out. And then the other is the speed, and is it sufficient for schoolwork, for video conferencing, for the kinds of access that we're really asking students to have. So the best of all worlds is that a home has unlimited data, such as from a cable connection or a DSL. And those are in some cases now being subsidized, and in some cases families are paying for them themselves. And then in some cases, there's a hotspot that can be provided to a child or a family, and that will allow them to have data wherever they go. They can carry that with them. There also are devices with built-in LTE that have a certain amount of data. So perhaps an iPad or a Chromebook with LTE. And then there are super hotspots. And much of what we're hearing about are these school buses that are being parked in various places in the community to provide some semblance of access. But the bottom line is the school does have to figure this out now. I know a lot is put on schools, everything from food preparation and food distribution to many other services that schools are providing. But in terms of equity, schools have to figure out a device and a home access so that teachers know what they can count on, and so that there is a level of parity and equity across their classroom.
Great, thank you. And speaking of the districts, let's go to Steve Webb. Steve, in a recent article, you discussed how Vancouver has achieved nearly 100% access for a 48% free reduced lunch student population. Can you talk about what you've put in place and what's needed to reach students in Vancouver that are still without access? And you're on mute as well. There we go.
I'll be that mean too, Karen. If we're committed to equity and excellence for each and every student in America's Vancouver, or for all students in this nation, we've got to think about this deliberately, strategically, and intentionally. We've been at this for some time in Vancouver Public Schools. We've scaled our digital transformation vision beginning in 2008. We've had two significant funding measures that are dedicated to ensuring 100% connectivity, 100% mobile learning access for every student in Vancouver Public Schools. That includes laptops and or iPad devices. It includes digital content, learning management, content management systems, assessment suites, everything relative to the way in which children interact and engage in learning in the 21st century. Fundamentally, we just knew that as we were embarking on this grand vision for personalized learning that prepares each and every graduate as a future-ready graduate with the competencies to thrive in an increasingly interdependent global economy, the 21st century skills that we've talked about for some time, we needed to step outside of our lane, not wait for the feds to step up and resource this, not wait for state agencies and local government to step up and resource this. We had to tell a compelling narrative around post-secondary success pathways for children. It's that narrative, it's that story, it's about ensuring every graduate is future ready that compelled our community to step forward and say, we're gonna pay for this so that regardless of wealth, regardless of race, regardless of whether or not children are differently able, they're all gonna have equitable learning opportunities to set them up for pathways for success.
Great, thanks, Steve. Baron, your district is in a more rural area, if you will, than Steve's in Vancouver, but you have achieved a similar access for your students. Can you tell us what you put in place and what's needed to reach the last mile, as you describe it?
Yeah, we are, you know, we're a great combination. I think the perfect recipe for diversity in our district. We have, we're really a suburban school district with a pinch of rural and a splash of urban, which makes for some great diversity in our schools. And we started the developing one-to-one for our district back in 1999. So we've been at it for roughly 21 years. So we've been able to build over time the infrastructure that was allowed us to kind of support this pivot from a brick and mortar classroom setting to a virtual setting, as well as simultaneously build the teaching capacity and also work with some of the pedagogical differences of a brick and mortar classroom versus a virtual classroom setting. So we've been fortunate in that sense, but as you stated, we have about 95% of our students have access to some form of internet access in the district, with about 93% of those students having actual Wi-Fi and about 7% having some sort of wired access. But that still leaves a good chunk of our students that are disconnected, and roughly about 12 to 1,400 students. And our responsibility at this point is to really identify who those individual students are and to assess what their individual needs are going to be. We've been focusing heavily on not just lack of access when it comes to technology or broadband or internet, but just community inequities that exist. And so how do we start addressing those community inequities so that our students live within a community at large? And so we can address some of these community inequities. We may be able to address some of these academic or educational inequities that exist, particularly the ones that COVID-19 has really explored or shine a light on. We are looking at some different funding opportunities, working with our State Department of Education to look at seeking some solutions that will help us when it comes to public and private partnerships that will help us connect those last mile of students. We're focusing a little bit on the E-rate programs as well. And if you remember, I know a little bit about the the Universal Service Fund that was created under the E-rate that focused on that last mile of expansive connection, but that was like for telephone service back in the day. So why not take that same mindset, take those same type of approach, and then dedicate that last mile connectivity to the internet access. And as I've shared previously, I do personally feel that connectivity should be a utility in every community. You cannot develop, design, build any community without water, electricity, or gas. And I think internet access or broadband access should be the same at a reasonable price that all can afford.
Great, thank you. We had some promising news last week, Jessica, with the introduction of the Emergency Education Connections Act, a $4 billion E-rate appropriation to ensure all K-12 schools have access during the pandemic. you share a little bit about how far you think this will go in addressing the gap and what other actions might be needed?
Sure. So as I think we've been talking about, E-Rate's the nation's largest education technology program. It's overseen by the FCC. It was the product of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, which was a long time ago. I mean, that's when we used to hear that buzz and hiss of the modem to connect to the information superhighway. But over time, we've taken this program, we've updated it. We've made it so that there are broadband connections available to the classroom. But now that classroom has moved home. It's on the kitchen table. It's the corner of the dining room. It's wherever a student is going to school in this crisis. And so I've pressed upon my colleagues the idea that why don't we look at that authority from 1996 and see if we can expand it. The language in there could support making sure that every student gets the opportunity to get connected at home. And there's a mix of ways we could do that, but we could use E-Rate to support things like loaning out Wi-Fi hotspots at every school library, making sure every student has the opportunity to connect at home. Now, despite the fact that I'm relentless on this and sometimes charming, my colleagues don't fully agree with me. But here's some good news. In the HEROES Act that passed Congress and the House last week, Congresswoman Grace Meng from Queens, New York, got in a provision to update E-Rate and make sure we have the funding and the clear legal authority to make this happen. And then last week as well, there were more than 40 senators who introduced a bill to do that on the Senate side. So what I'm seeing after talking about the homework gap for years and years is a recognition in this crisis that we can't leave kids offline. And so I'm a little impatient, but I'm also a little optimistic. I think when you see legislation on both the House and Senate side, I think there's a recognition we need to solve this problem. And I'm all for solving it in this crisis, but shame on us if we don't recognize that we got to solve this problem going forward, because digital equity requires keeping every student connected. And we can fix this really cruel part of the digital divide, not just for this crisis, but going forward.
Mm-hmm. Any additional thoughts to add there, Karen?
I would just add that's incredibly hopeful. So let's watch it happen. The additions to E-Rate. The other thing I want to point out, I want to do a shout out to Glenn Kleinman, who is in the comments, talking also about the workforce, adults and others who also need access. So as we go in through the student pathway, this also will help many, many parents and adults and others. So there needs to be other avenues. I know there's Lifeline and other kinds of, or Wireline, I can't remember what it's called. There are other ways of people getting connectivity as well through the FCC's programs. But I want to point out that that is actually really important, and especially today when we have upwards to close to 40 million people out of work. Those people need to work on skills they need to learn also, and they also need to be able to find new jobs. So I think that, keeping in mind that we are laser focused on the 55 or so million children that don't have access at home, and this is an expansive problem that can be solved in this country.
Great, thank you. Question that any of you can answer. Some districts have not started or have ended online learning because of inequities. There's a quote from Mark Siegel at the Oregon Department of Education that said, "You cannot open a brick and mortar school in Oregon unless it's accessible to every student in the district. The same rules apply to an online school." Would love to hear your perspectives on this position.
Let me jump in. I clearly understand that point of view if you're leading from an equity standpoint, and particularly in light of IDEA and ADA 504 rules and protections. We certainly want to avoid unnecessary conflict and potential litigation, but I think we also have to understand the importance of leading and serving with an equity lens for all of our students. So in light of this pandemic and the unprecedented context, our commitment to each and every student and family is to do the very best that we possibly can given that context. we know that we're going to have to plan for learning loss. We know that we're going to have to scale supports, whether that's remotely or through hybrid, in-person and remote. And in the event we return to some kind of normalcy in the fall or late winter, we'll have to scale those kind of supports, particularly for differently abled students. But at the end of the day, we've got to move forward and educate our children to the very best of our ability at this point in time. We know that we're going to have to plan for ESY and compensatory education programs. And I certainly appreciate Jessica's advocacy on the E-rate side of the equation, but we need to put pressure on the Department of Ed relative to IDEA flexibility and or resources to attend to this learning loss impact that it will clearly have on differently abled children.
I won't tackle the issue. I think Steve did a phenomenal job of tackling the issue as it relates to students of different learning abilities. Students of different learning abilities exist in schools, regardless of whether they're identified as students who receive special services or they're identified as students who are gifted and talented. I think it's almost impossible to avoid inequities that exist, because the inequities, and I'll go back to what I stated earlier, Kim, is that the inequities begin or are a part of the communities in which our students come from. Mm-hmm. I'm a little weary as we discuss the COVID-19 and what COVID-19 has exposed, but let's remember it's only exposed what actually already exists. So this is nothing new that already exists, and educators and those of us who work in this field already knew these inequities were already prominent in our school systems. But we have so many inequities that are part of what a student brings with him or her in his book bag to school. So whether there's inequity in food and shelter security, inequities in broadband or internet, inequities in healthcare, inequities in finance, they have these inequities with them everywhere that they go. I think our responsibility is to identify the institutional barriers and practices that exist that create inequities in the first place. And so I don't know if necessarily disbanding or banning the use of technology because of that actually exposes the institutional barriers and practices that created inequities, as opposed to addressing them while you're continuing to try to grow your infrastructure at your schools or your districts at the same time. I don't claim to be an expert on that, so I don't question the philosophical direction that guides that practice. However, that's the mindset from my equity lens in which I work from. Is I want to expose the institutional barriers and practices that exist and attack those things to eliminate them, while simultaneously trying to close the gaps that exist in our students based on the inequities they bring with them from their communities.
Mm-hmm.
Right on, brother.
Thank you, Baron. Appreciate that. Any thoughts to add?
I was just going to say, from a macro policy perspective, we have a tendency in this nation to address symptoms rather than get at root cause. And what has occurred during this pandemic is really a revelation, a magnification of the institutional inequities around resources. And here's what we know. Resource inequities disproportionately impact Black and brown children in this nation. And so if we were serious, we'd attend to the issue of poverty and resource distribution in such a way that sets families and children up for success. At the end of the day, that's what Jessica is advocating for. I know my colleagues, superintendents that are connected with the League of Innovative Schools, that's what they're committed to. And I suspect that those of us who are participating in this webinar share the same value set.
Great, thanks, Steve. Some questions coming in on the chat, so I'm just going to go there. There's a question about why K-12 schools are being held responsible for providing home access. rather than it being an issue to which all government agencies should be jointly responsible. Thoughts there?
I'll just jump in and just say exactly, right? If we had combined agency, if the Department of Labor was very concerned about people having access at home, if the Department of Treasury was interested in having equitable banking systems and making sure everybody had access to digital banking, if the Department of Commerce was very interested in everyone having access and equal opportunity to do business in this country. I mean, absolutely. If we could get all of the agencies aligned behind the notion that every American should be, and I know there is a global audience here too, so I don't mean to exclude other countries. I think every citizen in the world right now, in order to participate globally, needs to have access. But our government and the U.S. should be able to figure out how everybody in our country has access. I think sometimes about the school buses that people are outfitting with a super hotspot and driving into a parking lot and saying, "Come have access there," and I think. I'm picturing a family, a parent, a guardian, a grandmother, somebody getting their kids in the car saying, "Come on, we're going to go to school," going and sitting in the car in a parking lot near a bus so they can get access. I mean, we have it's hard enough when you're in the same home with children and dogs and cats and spouses, partners, so I can't quite imagine how that works, but it is absolutely better than nothing. So I applaud the people that have done that very quickly, and it is insufficient. We do need to get it in the places where people live and work.
Yes, thank you.
And by the way, and teachers too. I know there's a comment about teachers too. When we talk about students in this context, I've been thinking about the teachers too that don't have access at home. So yes, students and teachers.
Great, thank you. Jessica, there's a lot of accolades for your work to push forward what you're doing with the FCC. Just wanted to acknowledge that in the chat here. Can you talk about some other actions that you're looking to take going forward around this area?
Oh, yeah, at the agency?
Mm-hmm.
Well, there are 5 of us. I'm only one. I got to convince 2 others to get things done. And basically right now, my only tool is relentlessness. But what's been rewarding is that in this crisis, I feel that teachers, administrators, parents have all been speaking up about this problem. And I still believe that when vast communities like that come together, we can change the course of policy in this country. It was totally radical in 1996 when Congress said, "Hey, we got to connect schools and classrooms to the internet." It didn't really seem like the most natural thing to do, but I feel like we're at one of those same inflection points. Let's build on that by making E-rate more powerful so every student is connected and we build this new foundation for digital equity. But just like Karen said before, we got to actually think bigger as national policy, because we do need a plan for broadband for all. Because no student, household, community, or nation is going to thrive without figuring a way to get everyone connected. What we're facing now is akin to what we faced a century ago with electrification. We figured out how everyone could turn the lights on. This is the same infrastructure. It's what we need today. And talking about students is a subset of it, but it's just such a real one that people can identify with, no matter who they are or where they live. And so it's a really potent way to talk about this, and we got a really big problem right now in this crisis. So it's a useful way to force a broader dialogue, but it's also a problem that I think we can size. We may not have exact numbers. We know that there are millions of kids who can't connect right now. And in this crazy crisis where we can't figure out therapeutics and vaccines and all of these things, I'm convinced we can figure out how to get so many of those kids connected. And I'm convinced we can do it reasonably fast. So that's why we're going to keep on pushing this point as part of a broader agenda on the digital divide and connecting everyone to broadband.
Great, thank you. The hashtag relentless Rosenworcel is starting to trend here.
I don't know if my colleagues are going to look at that positively or negatively, but I'll take it. I'll take it.
Building on that, there's a question about how can we help your cause to eliminate the homework gap? What can educators and leaders do do more of or do a better job of? Any thoughts to that, Jessica?
Yeah. There are a lot of people who are some really high-priced lobbyists who are paid to come into the FCC and walk the halls of Congress and talk about these things. But there is nothing more powerful than hearing from teachers, educators, and even students themselves. You are the most powerful army we have, because when rural America writes in and says we have to solve the homework gap, and urban America writes in and says we have to solve the homework gap, I think it's possible we're going to be able to make change and make sure that the E-rate program is expanded to suit this moment and that kids are connected going forward. So don't hesitate to write in. And if you need some information about addresses, whatnot, you can email me. I work at the FCC, my phones work, all that. Because I really do think hearing from people across the country, letting myself and my colleagues know that you care about this and that it is a part of the digital divide we need to solve is really powerful. So speak up.
Great, thank you. Just an acknowledgement in the chat that not only do students need access, but someone's calling the attention to your teaching staff as well, Baron and Steve, that need access in these times. Can you talk about, both of you are looking at the re-entry, if you will, as we go into the next school year. How are you thinking about access and technology as you go into school year 2021 and beyond? Either one of you. Go ahead, Baron.
How we're thinking about access to technology. One of the things that we've done is that the Chromebooks that we've used, the devices that we've deployed, the vast majority of our students already had access to their devices to take home with them throughout the year already. We then deployed devices down to second grade. So second through now, fifth grade also had devices at home, and we're looking at K through 1. I'm currently researching or reviewing research on the effectiveness of technology in the hands of kindergartens and first graders, and what's the most effective way to do that. At the same time, looking at the pedagogical shift that it will take for our teachers to be most impactful in delivering virtual content to our students through that through technology. That's going to be important. Our students are able to, they're going to keep their devices over the summer. So we've also deployed hotspots and other things, buses. We've increased our Wi-Fi in our buildings so that the range can expand a little bit farther. Many of our schools are located within subdivisions of our school district, so access to that is not too difficult at all. And again, anyone who needs a hotspot, we're able to get those hotspots out to those students. We're currently working on trying to work on a plan with a local cable provider to see what the cost would be to put in modems and routers in some of the communities or some of the homes at a lower rate. And then also working on developing the final plans for in partnership with the infrastructure for those areas where we don't have the connectivity issues with connectivity. So there are multiple things, but as far as re-entry is concerned, I don't know. I've been asked that question 100 times. What are we going to do? When are we going to start? My preference is to start slow, and really fully get a grip, a grasp on what our challenges are before us, and at the same time continue to support our students academically and social emotionally through the mediums that we have right now, that we can do those things and improve upon those things. We're really getting the wheels turning in this direction right now, and I think an abrupt stop and then a re-entry could create even more of a disconnection when it comes to the delivery of instruction in the classrooms.
Great, thanks. Steve?
Yeah, I know reopening the economy, reopening schools is a subject to quite a bit of political debate. We're going to try in Washington to rely on the science. And much like Baron, I suspect that the guidance from Governor Inslee and our Department of Health will thoughtfully and carefully phase in reopening of the economy, and schools certainly will be part of that equation. I fully suspect that we'll have some kind of a hybrid model. It could include multi-track systems with students at different grade bands attending on certain days of the week and receiving remote instruction when they're not in attendance. We certainly have developed multiple plans given what public health guidance and rules are in place. We're just waiting for direction. Once we receive direction, we'll be able to work hopefully quickly to scale that in such a way that will enable us to pivot to provide both in-person and remote distance learning to students. I do want to say one other thing here. And I know that my friends at Digital Promise know that Vancouver Public Schools has been committed to whole child, whole system, whole community work for some time. We've got to lead from a trauma-informed lens. We've got young people in households in our neighborhoods who are coping with things unimaginable and responding to this crisis of disconnect, human connection with peers and with adults who love them with all of their heart. So we've got to really think about how do we, whatever the model looks like, how do we lead from an equity lens? How do we lead from a trauma-informed lens? And then how do we, even in a distant remote learning experience, how do we cultivate the kind of human connections, the kind of relationships that are absolutely so critically essential to the sense of self-worth, efficacy as a human being, and equally so as a learner.
Yeah.
How about that? Leading from equity instead of equity being tacked on at the end. Go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, I absolutely. You know, I think one of the things that has, well, actually, first I was just going to say, and we have very young children that think that schools are closed because they ran out of toilet paper. So there's that. But you know, the interesting thing is that teachers are, they always have been incredibly resourceful. They've had limited resources. They find things, they figure out ways of getting access to getting all sorts of things in their classroom and ways of connecting with people. So teachers, I think, have been heroes in this. Like overnight, no one's been saying teachers don't know how to use technology. Like that's not even the point. The point is that teachers are figuring things out overnight, figuring out how to connect with their students, how to get to the, if it's a telephone call, it's whatever it is, they are connecting and making sure they do that in a whole host of ways across the country. The other thing I would say is superintendents are partnership brokers, right? And so Baron mentioned working with the public, the providers, the infrastructure providers. That's an incredibly important thing to do. We've heard stories across the country of providers who are offering free access, and then after a little pressure, making sure that access isn't contingent on them not owing money already. But free access to the internet so that students can go to school with a device this spring. So some of those partnerships and relationships going forward are going to continue to be incredibly important. And then the third thing is that when we go back to school, the time is going to be so precious. The time between teachers and students face-to-face and students to students face-to-face, the time that people are in the same proximity is going to be incredibly precious. So really thinking carefully about what can the technology do? If students have a device, then maybe at home they can run their do their tests and that kind of thing, so that the teachers have more information, that they can have ways of getting information and deciding what things are best done at home and what are the very best uses of that in-school time. Because as Steve said, the relationships are everything, and that is the counter to trauma, and making sure that we're thinking about the research-based ways of addressing that are really important.
Yeah, Karen, let me just extend that thought for just a bit. As we look at hybrid models, we may have to consider flipping instruction so that when we've got a multi-track system and we've got 9 students in a classroom, we can then personalize with targeted and differentiated supports given the staffing ratios in person. But we're going to have to think about how do we scale that from an ecosystem that equips every teacher to create that kind of experience with some degree of coherence throughout the system.
Thank you. Question on, isn't the homework gap also a skills gap? Connectivity and access does not improve achievement. How do we teach students to use the virtual education world for academic growth? Any thoughts there?
I mean, I'll jump in one more time and then I'll be quiet. But the one thing that reminds me of is the digital learning gap, right? So the digital learning gap is 3 things. It's access. So we've talked a lot about access. And once we do solve access, or as we are solving access, the second is digital literacy and citizenship. It's how to participate. It's how to use the technology for personal empowerment, whether it's to find medical information or whether it's to learn or whether it's to find a job or do your banking or whatever it is. So that participation is 2. And then 3 is making sure that, as Steve was saying, we really think carefully about what are the uses of technology that are powerful, what are the ways we can really think about the time and space, and then the use of technology used in powerful ways. One of the really interesting things I've seen this spring is that students, when they went home, and some districts for very good reasons said, we're not grading, we're not going to be assessing your work, we want you to keep learning, keep working, we're not going to be providing you grades. And that was welcomed by some, and by some they were like, well, I'm not going to do anything then because I'm not getting a grade. And so that exposed this notion that some people are intrinsically motivated to learn and some have a sense of agency and self-regulation and those things. And that is going to become more and more important going forward as well.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let me chime in here on that question too. I don't think it's an either or, it's a both and. We've got to think about how do we leverage the digital learning ecosystem in such a way that engender the kind of outcomes we want for kids. So we got to backwards map this. It's okay to substitute, use technology as a substitution for paper and pencil as another set of tools. But at the end of the day, we've got to think about the kind of 21st century outcomes, the future ready skills we want to achieve with our young people, and then build out an instructional framework, an assessment framework, a digital content framework that empowers teachers to deliver the kind of authentic, engaging learning experiences that will develop those kinds of skills in our students. So when I think about project-based learning or other instructional frameworks that create really authentic real-world challenges for kids to wrestle with, we want to get to reinvention, using digital assets as a way of reinventing learning for our students.
Yeah, I see that as technology is used to connect us to our students. It's used to communicate. It can be used for creation and collaboration. All the C's that we strive for future ready students and for 21st century learners and for global citizens. The technology is just is a tool that allows us to do that. It does not and cannot replace teaching and what a teacher brings to the table. The skills gap, again, exists prior to technology. So it's important for us to remember that we're not solving problems like the skill gaps exist before that we had to pivot to a virtual platform, and those skills gaps were big in certain communities and in certain school districts, and so that hasn't changed at all. All this has done is magnify the importance of working to close those gaps that had already exist. It didn't make it any, it could possibly make it wider because you can't have that one-on-one connection. And so we need to make sure that we have structures in place that allow us to have that time to work with our most needy students while we are away from them. And maybe some of our time is we are looking at our time more equitable. Do I need to spend as much time with my AP student who is super motivated versus my student who is not as academically progressive as his classmates? Maybe I need now to be more equitable with my time and not equal with my distribution of time to all 25 students at the same time simultaneously. And so that's where really how we can close the skills gap. And that's where I think it's going to be important. And when we're closing the gap, we have to remember to close the gap for teachers who have never taught in a virtual platform, because it is a different pedagogical, there are different pedagogical strategies that are used to teach in a virtual platform than in a brick and mortar platform. And if you try to replicate a brick and mortar classroom virtually, we're not going to be successful in doing that. It is difficult to do. If you ever had to sit down and plan modules out for a virtual classroom setting, it is not like the same thing you will be able to do in a brick and mortar classroom.
Mm-hmm. Bit of a paradigm shift. Just acknowledging that there are members out here from the National Homework Gap Coalition. So they wanted to just acknowledge that they're in the audience here. A question came in about, are there any large dollar grants coming from the Department of Education set up to address access for students?
I think I know some of the CARES money that'll be distributed to districts can be used to help with access, if it's particularly the purchasing of devices or possibly the assistance with helping to create some infrastructure in your school district that will be able to support that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Baron, go ahead.
Yeah, Baron is absolutely right about that. I think it was $13.5 billion in the CARES Act. But the one thing that struck me about those funds is there was a really long list of things for schools. In other words, you could use this money for hiring mental health counselors. And I can't remember if it was Baron or Steve who talked about this trauma when we bring students back. You could use that money for sanitizing your classrooms and your public spaces. You could use that money for students who need additional assistance because they have, schools have obligations pursuant to the Americans with Disabilities Act. In other words, the list of things you could use that for was so long that while accessibility for devices and connectivity was in there, I would just argue that we have to start thinking about this separately because it's so fundamental. It needs a dedicated pool of funding to make sure every student at every school can get connected. And so while I think we can welcome the opportunities in the CARES Act and that $13.5 billion, I don't think we can look to it to solve our nation's homework gap problem.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Our portion of that is estimated at about $5.5 million, and we've spent that already in terms of PPE, in terms of additional Wi-Fi hotspots, summer learning loss program supports and fall learning loss program supports. And, there simply isn't enough resource capacity within that funding stream to do exactly what Jessica is advocating for.
Jessica, question about other FCC programs that you want to talk about, such as Wireline?
Yeah, well, Karen mentioned the Lifeline program, and that's really important. It got started in 1985. So that was like, I have to explain to the people in my office, that's when most phones were plugged into the wall with a curly cord.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was started during the Reagan administration. It was premised on this idea that everyone needed a phone. A phone was a lifeline. You wanted to maintain healthcare, call for emergency assistance, keep up with your kids' schools, get a job. You needed a number. And the reality is we got to update that program over time, because I think dial tone in the digital age is internet access. So the question is, can we make sure that that program, which helps subsidize telephone service in people's homes, can be updated for this moment we're in? We've already made it possible for those funds to go towards wireless service, because a lot of people just have a wireless phone now and not a wireline service. We've also done a little bit at the margins about using those funds for broadband, but we haven't given it the real push that we need to. And that's another opportunity to connect low-income households, not just households with students, but every low-income household. And as we look at the really tragic numbers of people who have filed for unemployment insurance, I think it's incumbent on the FCC to go back and revisit the Lifeline program and modernize it for the moment we're in. And that too could help with the homework gap.
Mm-hmm. Hear, hear.
I say we can do it, Jessica. I believe it can be done. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah, listen, I think if you don't use this crisis to make things happen, that's on us. We're demonstrating to people with perfect clarity now that broadband is not, nice to have, it's need to have. It's not a luxury good. It's a necessity to maintain some semblance of modern life. So we got to use all of this to figure out how to get it to everyone, everywhere.
Great, thank you. We have a couple minutes left here. Wanted to see if we can talk a little. Steve, I wanted you to mention your community resource centers briefly, and how they're a partner to you in this work. And then we'll, if anybody has any other thoughts around some solutions, we'll close out with some final thoughts. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, when we think about our community schools work, it really is about whole child, whole system, whole community supports to remove barriers to student learning in our classrooms and our schools. It really is about reducing those barriers that fundamentally get in the way of kids doing the very best they can in our classrooms. We've scaled the number of schools in our system that have this sort of social service hub from 2 to 18 since 2008. The number of partnerships have grown from 22 to 750. For every dollar that the district invests, and we invest approximately $1 million to resource staffs that serve in those social service centers, those community school hubs, we net $7 in return on that investment in a year. So last year, $7 million of community-based resources were brought to bear to respond to the challenges that children and families face. Everything in terms of basic needs relative to food, housing, medical, dental, vision, mental health services, pre-K early learning, out-of-school time programming, all of the kinds of things that children from more affluent families typically have those kind of assets already brought to bear. We've gone completely out of our lane as a K-12 system. And the reason we've done so is that if we're going to be held accountable for each and every student to get across the finish line, and our federal government will not step forward and address at the national level the issue of poverty and the magnification of economic disparity in this nation, we're going to step in and do our very best to ensure that every child, regardless of race, regardless of wealth, regardless of ability, has an equal shot to the American dream.
Thanks, Steve. Karen, Baron, Jessica, any closing thoughts?
I have one. Oh, go ahead, Baron.
Go ahead, Karen.
I have one idea that, one of the things I've been struck by is that it isn't a simple, like, just get access and that's it. There is the quality and the length and that kind of thing. So one of the things I've been thinking about is, could we create a program where certain websites, education websites, and you could include health information or any sort of profit types of websites that provide lots of educational information and educational resources and videos and explainers and all those kinds of things. Could you actually create a system where there was a white label, a white list of websites that would not count against your data allotment? And is there a way of creating a system such as that? And I think if we did something like that on a national scale with an oversight board and a very transparent and careful selection process, get all the providers to sign on to it, I think that is a piece of a solution that could help a little bit in this.
Great, great. Baron, you want to say anything?
Yeah, I want to just thank, of course, you, Kim, and the league for hosting this this platform for us, and say to Jessica, thank you for really coining that term, homework gap. And I would say to our leaders that's listening to us, that are in this with us, I hope that once we're able to come back to some sense of normalcy, that we don't forget that those inequities and those disparities already exist in our communities. I think it's going to be important because everyone's they're experiencing this at the same time. No one's pretty much immune from the fact that they have to work from home and someone's sick, but oftentimes we go back to our normal way of living. We forget about those challenges that the students may have, that, Baron may have to work to help support his family, or he may struggle or she may struggle to do certain things. And then we forget about that, and we assign homework, or we assign projects, or we have certain expectations from our frame, and we forget to consider the challenges that our students may face on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's important for us to continue to practice those things long after we have surpassed the COVID-19. We have an opportunity to really redefine public education in this country, and so we have a chance to continue to practice. As I share with my staff, grit. We need to continue to be mindful of our grit, as well as practicing grace. Continue to put purpose over our individual preferences, and do what we know is right for those students in our communities, and continue to fight to remove those institutional barriers that create these inequities in the first place.
Great. Jessica, you want to close us out here?
I don't know. I can't do better than these totally inspiring educators,
Yeah.
Not just professionally, but as a parent, these are the people you want, in charge of education. All right. In the end, I think that this crisis is not as much creating new inequities as it is exposing the ones that exist. Because the digital divide is a lot bigger than our country has been willing to acknowledge. And the consequences of consigning yourself to the wrong side are bigger than we've been willing to acknowledge. But I'm hopeful still, despite it all, that we can use this crisis to address the homework gap and make meaningful progress on the digital divide. And if we do those things, I think we will be stronger as a nation and in our communities going forward. So I'm hopeful that can happen.
Great. All righty. Well, thank you, Jessica, Steve, and Baron, for joining me and Karen at Digital Promise here for a really powerful conversation. Really glad to have you all here, and appreciate the good fight that you're doing. We are going to transition here. Next week, join us for a conversation on creating adaptive learning environments on Wednesday, May 27th at 4 p.m. Eastern. Registration opens tomorrow. You will receive an email with a recording of today's session and a link to register. We look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.